Hi, this is Dr. Randy Bach. Today's February 9, 2022. It's actually the 75th wedding anniversary of uh, my late and beloved parents, Sam and Dorothy Bach. So thank you for all you did. They worked together. They had a wonderful life together. My mom lived on quite a number of years after that. Um, and she was an amazing woman. I remember fondly my dad. He left us much earlier, but they were always devoted to each other. And my mother carried his memory on for a long time with a full life thereafter. So sweet thoughts to both of you in heaven together. And thank you for all the wonderful things you did for me um, and my brothers. We had one brother who lived before any of us, and he died at a young age of a neuroblastoma. Um, I'll give you this one quick anecdote. Uh, Perhaps if it holds interest for you as it does for me. Um, they had this one child, and they didn't move on to other children because he was ill, um, and they couldn't do anything for him at that time. And even today, it's a deadly illness. My father, uh, managed to cope, and this is always a big reason why couples broke up or had divorce. To have the death of a child, a first child, is devastating. They stayed together at the funeral. Uh, my mother's aunt um, came up to my dad and said, I know what caused that illness. His stomach had a cancer. She was mischaracterizing it, and it's because you had him in a car seat. They had been driving around in very rudimentary car seat in the early 1950s, just a bunch of pipes and whatnot. You would never see one in a car like that today. My dad was a very mild-mannered guy, um, erudite and thoughtful, and apparently at this moment he was ready to go at her. He was so devastated, and he was, I guess, never really got over the ignorance of that comment, and in some way to impute guilt on their part that they were, had some way done in their son by giving him the gift of letting him go around and see the world in the short number of years that he had, three and a half. I took that message as kind of an intolerance for misinformation, and misinformation is actually mislabeled quite a bit and is applied falsely these days for oftentimes the truth. Hers comment wasn't the truth, but I think my dad, not just from this incident, but just in general, always instilled in me and my brothers to find the truth and to find what actually happened, and don't be satisfied with pat answers. And I think it was that, story didn't really resonate with me because I heard it when I was so young. But in retrospect, I mean, I've taken that as a bit of a ethos, a challenge to carry on and look for the actual facts. It's not enough to say things the first thing comes into your head or belief and so forth when grave emotion and the turning of lives one way or another hold in the balance. Anyway, so I apologize for that long introduction, but today is an interesting day. For me, my mom always thought, I mean, I guess she wondered why February, why get married in February? It was in New York City, it was cold. They had a lot of snow around that time, and they had much more trouble getting around the streets. And perhaps we do now. The snow plows were not as developed and so forth. Um, but my dad and frankly all of my brother's other potential suitors had gone away to World War II, and right in my mom's prime, when people married earlier and more frequently back in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and my mom had to take a break along with the rest of the world for World War II, and my dad was one of the fortunate ones who came back, and so they married in 1947 after a little hiatus of. I guess my mom's picking and choosing whom she might choose to marry from the bunch of suitors that she had at the time. She was a very vivacious and charming young woman, from what I understand. She was talented, she's artistic, and all that kind of stuff. And things were a little bit different. If you want to get a real window on that world, I recommend this book by Herman Wouk, Marjorie Morningstar. It's really an excellent view of the kind of the dating scene and how people carried social relationships back then. And it's he's a marvelous writer. He wrote The Winds of War and the Caine Mutiny and so forth. So anyway, book reviews, my parents' anniversary, memories, and search for the truth. So I'm not going to give my usual talk for a Wednesday evening as part of the coronavirus conversation. In part, I'm not quite fully talked out, but I had an excellent conversation a couple of days ago with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, an epidemiologist, economist, and physician who, along with Sunitra Gupta and Martin Kulldorff from Oxford and Harvard, respectively, authored the Great Barrington Declaration in the fall of 2020, which emphasized focused protection, letting society as a whole open up and focusing our protection on those most vulnerable, basically the elderly and the infirm. And, it's very fascinating to me that Doctors Collins and Fauci, the NIH and NIAID, were recently uncovered through Freedom of Information Act to have pilloried those eminent researchers and physicians and done everything they could to cast focused protection as a misinformation, when in fact, of course, it wasn't, and was very valuable. They wanted to control the narrative. I guess they succeeded to varying extents. I frankly think it's criminal to do what they did from their perches in government. So I highly recommend you go see my other interview. And if you need a link, I'm happy to provide it. But I think that you should, you'll probably get a lot of amazing information from Dr. Bhattacharya. He's one of the brave soldiers out there in the epidemiologic sense. If in fact this is epidemiologic war in one way or another, or the war for our hearts and souls and our freedoms. Just as a mild shout out or honk, our brothers up in Canada, aka America's hat. I joke. I know I have Canadian in-laws and so forth. So I love them. But frankly, most of them are on the side opposite of the truckers who are working towards getting their freedoms back. And it's a sadness that has to be the case, that we have to work extracurricularly to get those things that are granted to us by God and, held in proxy by certain of our governments. So part of my speechifying over the weeks has been that there's a meta virus. There's not just the coronavirus, but there's another virus, which is governance and the way it can be manipulated. And, what are the weaknesses? I mean, this coronavirus has shown the weaknesses in our information system and our governmental system. And I think the parliamentary countries have done worse. Canada, Australia, New Zealand have done worse than those with presidential constitutional republic aspects, because Parliament is essentially a tyranny of the majority, even if it's your majority. And it's not necessarily a full tyranny. It may be able to be turned over time. There's far more concentrated power in a parliamentary system than in a constitutional republic, which reserves rights oftentimes to the individual states and between the various branches of government, whether judicial, executive, and legislative. Anyway, without doing too much civics there, I think it's very important to keep an eye out for what's going on there, because hopefully our freedoms will come back, but they have to be worked for. They have to be earned. Benjamin Franklin, I think, said it's a republic if you can keep it, and referring to our country. And the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, all those things are pieces of paper. They're on parchment, and we like to think that they are operative as law, but they sometimes are observed in the breach. People can get around things. They'll get around things. Like water. People oftentimes will find the lowest level and move straight ahead in that regard. Anyway, so the topic of today's talk, to finally get to it, is something I've been working on. I'm putting on basically the capstone or the keystone or the last chapter, the epilogue of my book, Overturning Zika, which is coming out shortly, within the next few weeks, maybe a month or so. I'm trying to do a push in Brazil first, but I felt like it needed a chapter on the great missing Zika vaccine. And our experience with COVID for the vaccine, it has at least one positive, that one was created. Um, there's those T-shirts. My parents went to Las Vegas and all I got was this lousy T-shirt. Well, for Zika, which ostensibly caused microcephaly in babies whose mothers had experienced the infection in the first trimester, um, uh, they were just told, never to have kids until we have a vaccine, and just kind of wait. And a lot of government ministers throughout the Americas, not here per se, except possibly in Puerto Rico, and there was some mention there, we're told just stop having kids. That's the answer. And we'll get a vaccine and you sit tight. And when that comes around, we'll vaccinate everybody and then you can go back to having kids. So that I thought was an amazing incident right then and there. I mean, it's really never been mentioned from public health officials to stop having children. Having children as above, my parents, is that's how we got here. Wouldn't be talking to you if somebody hadn't had kids, and presumably nobody's going to be talking to anybody else unless we carry on the race. We're here to produce. We're also here to reproduce. So I thought I'd just kind of go over that chapter. I'm not going to read it word for word, but you can take a look at it, and I'm going to add it to the stream now. So I think there's some really instructive aspects about the Zika vaccine. And I'll just pull it up and maybe breeze through it a little bit. And if you have any interest in that or the book, let me know. And again, for our real coronavirus conversation, I recommend you look at my piece from a couple days ago with Jay Bhattacharya. So let me get on my reading glasses here. The broken promise of the Zika vaccine, women's lives in limbo. The vaccine story we know by heart is COVID-19. So I'm not going to really go over that too much, but just to highlight for Zika microcephaly, and again, I think, Zika microcephaly has disappeared since 2015, 2016. I don't think it was all that to begin with, but nobody knew about that. Nobody knows my theory, frankly. And everyone in the public health establishment is still, hewing to the theory that that Zika microcephaly was real. And so they're working under the threat that this can come back anytime. And in the meanwhile, like I said here, government ministers in various countries, Colombia, El Salvador, Jamaica, parts of Brazil, told people to stop having kids until a vaccine could be developed, at least in part. Hundreds of thousands of women probably listened because the birth rate did decline throughout the Americas and in Brazil in particular. But now it's 2022, 7 years later, and there's been no Zika vaccine. Part of that reason is clearly it disappeared. So maybe there was a little bit less push, less emphasis on creating a vaccine. And so, public health specialists who, pretty much see them as generals in an epidemiologic war, they don't want to start a vaccine trial with no upside. If nobody's getting sick from the illness, there's only going to be vaccine problems and side effects and no benefit. And that can give vaccines a bad name. So, a lot of the public health aspect, the root word of public health is the same as the root word for politics. And I think there's a political aspect, a political equation. That being said, they still, managed to do things poorly. And we're going to get to that in a second. So in comparison, however you feel about the vaccine, there was a promise of a vaccine. It was delivered for COVID, that is. So, I'm actually quite a fan of Operation Warp Speed. I think it's, one of Donald Trump's greatest achievements. And however you feel about vaccine mandates and the vaccine itself, and whether it still is pertinent in 2021 and 2022, once the vaccine has, once the virus itself has moved on from the ancestral version, I personally don't think it has the same efficacy and power and force and usefulness as it did, as if we could have had it, in 2019 before people got sick. That would have been the best, like a flu shot. You get it beforehand. But even so, I think it's, pretty much helped with the ancestral version, and to a lesser extent, the following alpha, beta, delta strains. I think Omicron is too far away from the original version to really be usefully covered by the ancestral vaccine. And I've covered this before. We've moved on from certain monoclonal antibodies as treatment once they age out, and we haven't done that with the vaccine for some reason. But anyway, but either way, The Operation Warp Speed, the COVID-19 vaccine, was an unprecedented tour de force. It combined the speed, innovation central to business with the funding, bureaucratic reach, and lifting of liability needed from government. So this, is one of the most amazing things ever happened. It's almost the Manhattan Project of vaccines, and everyone should be applauded. You know, in its rollout, especially considering that it was a novel vaccine mechanism, encapsulating mRNA within a lipid nanoparticle shell. Um, so, you know, in business, you want to underpromise and overdeliver. I think that you set reasonable expectations, then knock them out of the park. And while this hasn't quite happened with the COVID-19 vaccine, the actual production of it did do that. People were promised, that with COVID-19 vaccine, the lockdowns and restrictions would disappear, there'd be a return to normalcy. We haven't received that. That's really a problem more with government, I think, than the vaccine itself. I have a friend who's very frustrated by this, a very bright guy, a computer scientist, and he says he's been thraxed, triply vaccinated, and people in Israel are being quadruply vaccinated, and he still got Omicron. I think this is really kind of a category error, and I've mentioned it over here. The things I've been talking about before, that the current versions are not covered by the vaccine that's really referring to a virus that's more than 2 years old. Anyway, so that's COVID-19. We're all familiar with that. But what about the Zika vaccine? Again, nobody's really heard of it because it never came into production. So I have, like the little engine that could. I have the little Zika vaccine engine that couldn't. And this, the COVID-19 story is obviously one of imperfection because it involves humans. But the Zika vaccine situation actually is worse. And this is from an article in The Atlantic, A Country Without Babies. And I'm not going to read the whole quote, but it goes over some of the things I mentioned before, that people were, told to stop having kids. And there's some hypothetical questions here at the bottom. If you heard that message, would you take it seriously? What would society look like, with no kids and a depleted younger generation unable to support older ones down the road 5, 10, 25 years later? This has happened to a certain extent in the places that listened. Still there are hundreds of millions of women throughout the tropics of reproductive age interest with the future of their families at risk, and they're owed, either the vaccine reward, or they should be told that, they should stop waiting, or perhaps that Zika, microcephaly may not have been an actual thing, since it never seemed to have recurred once people were looking at it more carefully. There was enough science. It's not that long ago, 2015, 2016. Basically, the same virus, vaccine capabilities we had in 2019, 2020 existed then. And frankly, one of the vaccine types was a similar mRNA vaccine. It was proposed by Moderna, and they might still do one later on. We'll get to that. And there had been existing vaccines that could help. Dengvaxia, which is a vaccine for dengue, as you might imagine, had started in 2009, and Zika and vaccine are pretty much twins. Zika and dengue are pretty much twin viruses. They share, I think it's mentioned later on here, but they share about 60% of the same genome, and they're indistinguishable physically. Zika, if it does cause any human illness, causes a mild version of dengue. It may or may not actually do that, but we'll leave it at there. There was some problem with Dengvaxia because people thought that there was potentially more severe disease if you were vaccinated and got reinfected. So there was the capability of making the dengue vaccine. Equally, they could have made Zika vaccine. It's pretty much the same thing, same virus. They're in the same family. They're both flaviviruses, and they're, again, almost the same genome. So there's all this excitement when Zika, was a thing in 2015 and 2016. And if you just look on YouTube, here's some videos about making a Zika vaccine, developing Zika vaccine. Human trials for Zika vaccine are going to begin. But these are from 2016 and into 2017. And things kind of like stalled. We have our friend here again, Dr. Fauci in the New England Journal, considerations for developing a Zika virus vaccine. But all these were like your New Year's resolutions. You make them and then you break them as time moves on. Sanofi, which made the dengue vaccine, here's the chief scientific officer talking about it. He was very optimistic. He thought Zika qualified as something that was a big enough problem for you to kind of pull the trigger um, for a vaccine. And then he says here that Zika, Sanofi should be able to do it really quickly because they have dengue already on the market. And as I said here, he mentions that the Zika and dengue are very, very similar, 60% genetic similarity. And Dr. Fauci is optimistic as well. In 2016, we're going to get on this right away, basically by the end of that year. And then phase 2 trials did begin at a number of sites. There was, $1 billion had been approved by the U.S. Congress, and there was a lot of research money to go around. So they were going to do this in the United States and certain tropical countries in the Americas. And then what happened? Well, I don't know. I mean, I believe this is Dr. Fauci again. I'm totally intent on getting this vaccine to the point where it could be usable. It's a high priority. And into 2017, there were still a lot of, I don't know if you can see this chart here. I'm not going to go into detail, but there were, 10, live clinical studies of vaccine types, and they all differed from one type to another, including the mRNA type. But then what happened? I don't know. It's a funny thing. They had at the end of 2016, they spent, I don't know, gosh, it looks like $1 million to get a bunch of bioethics ethicists together, and they produced this huge white paper. I think it's about 80 pages or something like that, in February 2017 about the ethics of using and of doing the research for a Zika vaccine. They, over time, there have been experiments with treatments involving poorer patients, and the Tuskegee experiment is an example. Is one I mentioned here. They didn't want to duplicate, where it looks as if you're taking advantage of a poorer, less educated population. So they did this all ethical study, and they pointed out that finding yellow fever and the experimentation in Cuba had done had been done well ethically. But more recently, in the 1940s, similar to the Tuskegee experiment, there was one in Guatemala, which had failed to obtain the informed consent of the research subjects and so forth. And so they were kind of chewing on this question whether a Zika vaccine trial should purposefully infect individuals. It's so-called controlled human infection model, or CHIM. And the answer was no. Where's the answer here? This is kind of the key page. I've made the highlights and the red marks. The ethical considerations for Zika virus human challenge trials. And so the real question is, can a Zika virus human challenge trial be ethically justified? That is, to give people Zika if they didn't have Zika. And they come up with the answer, no, don't do that. And yet, when Zika disappeared, that should have been, frankly, reasons just to kind of shelve the whole thing and take away the emergency status. And so beyond everyone's wildest hopes and dreams, Zika disappeared. So what did they do instead? Did they say, declare victory and move on? No, they have this headline here in Science: as massive Zika vaccine trial struggles, researchers revive plan to intentionally infect humans. The highlight here is mine. The disappearance of Zika in the Americas makes it tough for the $110 million trial to evaluate worth of the vaccine candidate. So you have $110 million, as Dr. Fauci mentions here. Right now, there are no infections, and certainly not enough to even think about an efficacy signal at this point, says Dr. Fauci. So ideally, you would just step away. And what I say here, declare victory and gone home. But in fact, they didn't. On the one hand, a Brazilian investigator, part associated, he said it's a good dilemma because we don't have Zika anymore, but it's a dilemma. Everybody's concerned about it. It's a lot of investment. So I appreciate they, understand money's been spent, and they don't want money to be spent purposelessly. But this falls into what I call the sunk cost fallacy. And here's an explanation. It's a cute little cartoon, and you can go over this. But the more our past investment, the harder it is to abandon it. We ignore the promise of a better experience in the future by making an attempt to negate a loss in the past. In other words, our past investments over influence our current decisions. So they didn't know when it's going to happen again, but they wanted to go ahead and do it. So these are a couple of doctors, Dr. Anna Durbin out of Johns Hopkins. Um, she felt that avoiding infecting humans would be a great setback. If we had been allowed to go forward, we'd know today which vaccines look good. So she's not happy about that. And she turned to the bioethicists to try to undo their ethics report. And you can see here, this is actually from the same Science article, Zika's Vanishing Act. And this is January 2016. But once they really looked at microcephaly better, and they looked at Zika, they had better testing, everything disappeared in North America and South America. And these are really negligible numbers considering what they thought the epidemic was. And these continue out to this day, pretty much at zero every year after. The head bioethicist, with the chair of this report, Dr. Seema Shah, she actually turned I think she turned the ethics report on its head. She said, right now in 2018, when there's frankly, it's over here, there's no Zika going on. She says there's a compelling reason to conduct a human challenge trial now. The details are complicated, and it's important to have a rigorous review. So I think the second sentence is just gobbledygook, cover your butt, and so forth. But Dr. Fauci nonetheless echoes it. If they're careful, we have no problems supporting a human infection model, CHIM. Zika was a very ominous threat just a couple of years ago, and there's certainly a possibility it's going to come back. It's a risk that you'll spend this money and never use the vaccine, but balancing the importance of this infection and the impact it could have, we felt it was a good decision to move ahead. And I would be happy, or as in my Fauci voice, and I would be happy to defend that anywhere. According to this 2018 article, Dr. Durbin hopes to start injecting Zika virus into people immunized with a vaccine in 2019. So it's kind of like either one or the other. Either this is so dangerous that we should really be aware of it, or we're going to inject people in it. I think you undercut the whole ethical argument if the thing has disappeared and you still want to inject people with it because you want to have the vaccine. I don't think this was about helping people anymore. And frankly, I think it has shades more of the Tuskegee experiment, of the Guatemala experience, than it does of the Walter Reed positive experience in Cuba a century ago. So this, I think pretty much I'm fairly sure this didn't come to pass. I've actually not, found a firm conclusion. I'm going to send a letter to doctors Durbin and Shaw and ask them this, but I don't think they actually did wind up injecting people. But to get to my point, if the major thesis of my book, Overturning Zika, is true, then there should never be any future worries of Zika microcephaly vaccine or not. If it does somehow, if I'm wrong, and it does somehow reappear having been real in the first place, technology has far improved in the meanwhile, and amping up for a vaccine would take place in its own due course much more rapidly than previously. The overall good news from COVID-19 is that mRNA vaccines can be made fairly quickly once the proper coding has been done. And the CEO of Moderna pretty much echoes this. This is, he said, within the last year, he's hoping to get a Zika vaccine to market, and he could do an mRNA version. So, I think there's some instructive things here. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I'm probably just going to end with a quick photo album of some of the thoughts that I had this last week via memes. This is comparing, I mean, you could just maybe go over the countries and see which ones, how well they do as parliamentary republics versus constitutional republics or semi-presidential. And, I think Sweden did the best in Europe in maintaining personal freedoms. This is a quote from Frederick Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. And it's a depressing aspect that scientists and scholars, put themselves readily at the service of the new rulers. And it's one of the most depressing and shameful spectacles in the whole history of the rise and fall of National Socialism. Anyway, I think you should, take a look at that quote. You can pause. What else we got here? You can just take a look at these. I think they speak for themselves. Here's Neil Young fans trying to delete Spotify. That's a whole nother episode from last week. Trudeau demands truckers get vaccinated like he did so they don't catch COVID like he did. I think he recently used COVID as an excuse to get away from talking with the truckers. Anyway, so I think I'm going to stop here, and I wish you a wonderful week in COVID and all other things. And may you stay healthy, happy, and exert your will so that we can maintain free, not just from COVID, but free in general. And so thank you so much for spending the time with me tonight. If you're curious about anything Zika, please let me know. I'll try to put you on my mailing list for the Zika book